Growing up in my family was a lesson in inequality disguised as love. On the surface, everything seemed normal. We had a house, meals on the table, parents who were present in the usual ways. But beneath that veneer, there was a pattern, a subtle current that ran through every interaction: favoritism. And I wasn't the favored child. From the moment my little brother was born, the differences were glaring. Vacations were tailored to him, hobbies were encouraged with financial backing, gifts were always grander, and privileges piled up like nothing I had ever experienced. He could ask for something: a new bike, special lessons, or even a trip, and it would appear as if by magic. I, on the other hand, was constantly reminded of limitations. We can't afford that right now, or maybe next year. Those words were repeated so often I began to accept them as a normal part of life. But inside, a simmering frustration grew. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was more talented, more athletic, more charming, more deserving. Maybe the disparity wasn't about favoritism at all. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew the truth. The uneven treatment was intentional, and it followed a logic I didn't understand as a child but eventually unraveled as an adult. It wasn't until much later that I discovered something that completely reframed my entire perspective. My dad wasn't my biological father. That revelation hit me like a freight train. Suddenly, the inexplicable favoritism, the mountains of resources allocated to my brother, the way my parents seemed to bend over backward for him while leaving me behind, it all made sense. My brother wasn't just the younger sibling. In their eyes, he was literally their own flesh and blood, the child who carried their genes. That invisible thread of connection granted him privileges I could never hope to attain, no matter how hard I tried. Even before I knew this, I had felt the sting of neglect in the smallest of ways. I had a gap between my two front teeth, and as my adult teeth came in, the gap grew. I begged my parents for braces, not out of vanity, but out of a desire to feel normal, to avoid the teasing that came with crooked teeth. The response was always the same: "We don't have the money for that right now." And yet, when my brother expressed interest in bull riding, a costly, dangerous sport, thousands of dollars suddenly appeared for lessons, gear, and travel. Over the first 2 years alone, they'd likely spent close to $40,000. Meanwhile, my simple request for $2,500 brasses remained unmet. Dismissed as an extravagance he couldn't afford. By the time he turned 16, the disparities became impossible to ignore. He received a brand new truck, gleaming and pristine, while I had to make do with a worn-out conversion van that barely ran and was unsafe to drive. Every mile I drove, it felt like a reminder of my parents' priorities. Every mile he drove his shiny new truck felt like a testament to the gap between us, not just in material possessions, but in how we were valued as a child. I internalized it all. I convinced myself that life was unfair but unchangeable. I tried to ignore the resentment bubbling inside me, tried to smile when my parents lavished attention on him, tried to cheer when he achieved something while I struggled for recognition. But every action, every decision, every moment reinforced the hierarchy my parents had built. I remember a vivid incident from my teenage years. I had been saving up for months, working part-time jobs after school to afford a new set of books for college prep. I came home excited, hoping to show my parents how responsible I had been. Instead of encouragement, I got a dismissive glance. Meanwhile, my brother returned from a bull riding competition with a shiny new saddle, custom boots, and a check for winning a local rodeo. My parents celebrated his victory with laughter and fanfare, ignoring my quiet accomplishment. That day, I learned that effort and achievement meant far less than bloodlines in my parents' eyes. The first major crack in this carefully constructed golden bubble came in the form of a DUI. My little brother, who had been spoiled and coddled, made a reckless choice behind the wheel in Texas, and Texas does not mess around. My parents, who had spent tens of thousands on ensuring his success and happiness, suddenly discovered that money couldn't fix everything. He served 3 weeks in county jail. The reality was a shock. The child who had never faced real consequences, who was now experiencing the law firsthand. And yet the story didn't end there. 6 months after his release, he was pulled over again. And this time the consequences were severe. Another DUI, littering, evading police, and a stack of hefty speeding tickets. Someone in our city discovered the record and posted it on Facebook, blasting our family name. My parents were frantic. They told me to stay silent, but I ignored them. This was a rare moment when the golden child's pedestal was removed, and suddenly the weight of his privilege backfired spectacularly. Watching the aftermath unfold was surreal. Thousands of dollars poured into legal fees. Reputation, once meticulously curated in our small community, was destroyed. For the first time, the disparity that had haunted me my entire life turned the tables. I couldn't help but laugh, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief and a sense of justice long overdue. I told them bluntly, what fun it must be to have such a wonderful child. and the words carried the satisfaction of years of frustration finally acknowledged. That period of my life left indelible marks. I had grown up in the shadow of favoritism, always second in line for love, resources, and recognition. I had learned early that fairness didn't exist in my family and that I had to fight for my worth in quiet, invisible ways. But I had also learned resilience, observation, and the bitter but necessary lesson that privileges and wealth cannot protect someone from their own mistakes forever. This was just the beginning. The real fallout, the emotional reckoning, and the long-term consequences for all of us would unfold in ways I couldn't have predicted. When the legal and social consequences of my little brother's actions hit our family, everything changed. Part of me had anticipated some form of comeuppance, but the reality was far more intense than I could have imagined. Watching my parents scramble in ways they had never had to before was almost surreal. For years, their golden child bubble had insulated them from responsibility. Money could solve anything. Lessons, gear, vehicles, vacations, but suddenly, it couldn't. Suddenly, their favoritism had a price, and the bills weren't for bull riding boots or shiny trucks. They were for lawyers, fines, and humiliation. It started quietly. After his first DUI, my parents were frantic. The worry wasn't about whether he had endangered lives. That didn't seem to enter their minds, but about the financial implications. How much would the fines cost? How much could they bribe the system with their lawyers? Texas doesn't play around with drunk driving offenses, and my parents quickly realized this wasn't something they could just write a check for and have disappear. The first stint in county jail was a shock, and for the first time, my brother felt the weight of consequences that he had never known. But the real disaster came months later. After only 6 months out, he was pulled over again. This time, the offenses piled up. Another DUI, littering, evading police, and some of the highest speeding tickets I'd ever seen. The moment the news hit Facebook, the backlash was instantaneous. Someone in our community, clearly fed up with the constant shielding and favoritism my parents had indulged, posted the details for everyone to see. Suddenly, our carefully curated reputation, the one my parents had spent years building by showing off the golden child as the perfect son, was shattered in one public, viral post. My parents were frantic. They came to me, their voices low, desperate. "Don't talk about it," they said. "Keep your mouth shut. This is a family matter." But I couldn't. I didn't want to. Years of pent-up frustration and bitterness had boiled over, and seeing them struggle under the very consequences they had shielded my brother from for so long was almost intoxicating. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I simply smiled and said, "What fun it must be to have such a wonderful child," and walked away. The legal fallout was massive. Thousands of dollars poured out of my parents' accounts for legal fees. Every lawyer's bill, every consultation, every court fine added to the tension that had been simmering for years. The power they had wielded over us as children, the ability to manipulate, bribe, and control, suddenly became meaningless. They couldn't buy their way out of this. No money, no influence, no pleading could erase the public record or the community's judgment. I watched the entire process unfold, and with every passing day, I saw more clearly how my parents had operated. They had favored my brother not out of love, but out of a sense of genetic investment, a belief that bloodlines mattered more than fairness, kindness, or justice. All the vacations, gifts, and lessons had created an inflated sense of invincibility in him. He had been taught that consequences were temporary, that failure was something that could be erased with cash or charm. And now, for the first time, the real world was teaching him lessons my parents had never taught me. Responsibility, accountability, and the painful weight of choices. Even though my brother's behavior caused chaos, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vindication. As a child, I had been denied opportunities, belittled for minor mistakes, and constantly reminded of my place in the family. Watching my parents lose control, watching them scramble for solutions, watching the facade of perfection crumble, was a form of justice, delayed but deserved. But it wasn't just legal or financial consequences that mattered. The emotional fallout was staggering. My parents, who had always relied on appearances and the illusion of control, were unprepared for the social consequences. Friends, neighbors, and extended family began questioning the choices they had made, and the hypocrisy was undeniable. They had spent tens of thousands on bull riding lessons while denying me braces. They had given my brother a brand new truck while I drove a barely functional conversion van. And now, the golden child was publicly exposed as reckless, spoiled, and undisciplined. There was a strange shift in the household. My brother, once the untouchable center of attention, now faced scrutiny, criticism, and tangible consequences. My parents, who had always presented a united front of favoritism, were now stressed, defensive, and constantly on edge. For the first time, I saw vulnerability in them, a chink in the armor they had worn for so long. It was surreal to witness, almost like the universe was balancing the scales. Meanwhile, I started reflecting on the years of disparity I had endured. I realized that my experiences, while difficult, had shaped me in ways that my brother's sheltered upbringing hadn't. I had learned resilience, patience, and the value of self-reliance. I had understood early on that fairness wasn't guaranteed, that life doesn't always reward those who deserve it. And now, I had a front row seat to seeing the consequences of unchecked favoritism firsthand. The incident also taught me something important about power, privilege, and accountability. My parents' favoritism had insulated my brother from reality, creating a distorted sense of entitlement that ultimately led to his downfall. It also revealed the fragility of their own authority. All the money, gifts, and privileges couldn't shield them from consequences in the real world. And most importantly, it highlighted the necessity of self-advocacy and independence, lessons I had learned the hard way but that my brother had yet to understand. Through all of this, I began to gain a sense of clarity and empowerment. I realized that the unfairness I had experienced as a child didn't define me. My worth wasn't determined by my parents' favoritism, and their failures as guardians didn't dictate my future. Instead, I could choose to learn from their mistakes, to recognize injustice, and to chart my own path without relying on their approval or resources. The social fallout continued over the next few months. Friends and neighbors whispered, gossip spread, and online forums dissected every detail of my brother's DU as my parents' embarrassment was compounded by shame. And for the first time, I realized just how public the consequences of their favoritism could be. They had invested everything in building an image of perfection for my brother, only to watch it crumble spectacularly. And I, who had long been denied recognition, finally felt a strange satisfaction. The scales had shifted, and for once, fairness had, in a way, been restored. This period also forced my brother to confront himself. No longer able to rely on parental indulgence, he had to face the law, his peers, and the reality that actions have consequences. My parents, meanwhile, were forced into reflection, though whether they truly internalized their mistakes was unclear. But one thing was certain: the golden child facade had been irrevocably damaged, and the family dynamic would never be the same. By the end of this chapter of our lives, the household had changed irreversibly. My parents had lost their sense of untouchable authority. My brother had lost his unearned invincibility, and I had gained a new understanding of fairness, resilience, and the complexities of family dynamics. By the time we reached the final phase of this story, the fallout from my little brother's actions had transformed our family in ways none of us could have predicted. What had once been a household built on favoritism, inequality, and silent resentment was now a landscape of accountability, embarrassment, and hard-earned clarity. Part of me had anticipated closure, but the reality was far more complex and far more satisfying than I had ever imagined. The long-term consequences for my parents were staggering. Their finances, once seemingly untouchable due to years of careful planning and wealth accumulation, had been decimated by legal fees, fines, and restitution for my brother's reckless choices. With the tens of thousands of dollars they had spent to ensure he had every advantage in life had become, ironically, meaningless. Money could no longer protect him from the law, the public eye, or even the embarrassment of being called out by neighbors and strangers alike. It was a lesson they could never have taught him themselves. Privilege only goes so far when personal responsibility is absent. I watched them struggle to reconcile their parenting choices with reality. My father, who had always presented a stoic, unflinching front, now seemed smaller, weighed down by the consequences he had ignored for so long. My mother, once a defender of my brother's every whim, oscillated between frantic attempts to mitigate damage and quiet despair. There was no magic solution, no simple way to fix the situation. The power they had wielded for years had evaporated, and for the first time, they were forced to face the limits of influence. As for my brother, the impact was life-altering. The dues, the fines, the public shame, they were all lessons he could, where no longer escape. Privilege had shielded him from failure his entire life, but now, reality had taken over. He experienced firsthand the consequences of entitlement and recklessness. While I had spent my youth learning resilience, self-reliance, and the value of effort in a world that often seemed unfair, he was now forced to confront the harsh truth that life doesn't bend to favor, and money cannot fix all mistakes. Meanwhile, I began the process of reclaiming the life I had been denied. I had grown up, overshadowed, ignored, and underappreciated, but now, for the first time, I had space to assert myself. I applied to jobs, pursued opportunities I had previously been hesitant about, and started building a life on my own terms. I no longer felt constrained by the invisible hierarchy my parents had imposed. The golden child had been exposed, and the residual power dynamics shifted in my favor. One of the most empowering moments came when I realized I could finally laugh about it. Not at my brother, not cruelly, but at the absurdity of the entire situation. The lavish spending, the inequality, the years of silent frustration they had all built up to this tipping point. And when my parents tried to lecture me about loyalty, family reputation, or discretion, I simply smiled. I knew the truth. Their choices had consequences, and I had survived them. The social ramifications were also profound. Our community, which had once admired my family's perfect facade, now saw them in a new light. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances whispered about the DUIs, the fines, and the relentless favoritism that had fueled my brother's reckless sense of invincibility. The online posts detailing every transgression spread quickly, and my parents' reputation, carefully curated for decades, was irreparably damaged. It was a stark reminder that actions, no matter how privileged or protected, carry consequences. In the wider world, this phase of the story also forced reflection. I thought about the years of disparity I had endured, the sacrifices I had made, and the resilience I had built. I realized that my hardships had shaped me into a person capable of navigating adversity with strength and clarity. My brother, though talented and charming in many ways, had yet to develop the same awareness. Privilege had protected him, but it had also delayed his growth. The consequences he now faced were harsh, but necessary. Over time, our family dynamics shifted irreversibly. I learned to set boundaries with my parents, to assert my own needs, and to recognize when their influence was toxic. I stopped seeking approval or validation from them, understanding that their favoritism and poor judgment were reflections of their limitations, not my worth. My brother, meanwhile, began to face the reality of adulthood, responsibility, accountability, and the undeniable truth that life doesn't always favor the golden child. By the end of this chapter, a new equilibrium emerged. My parents were humbled, my brother was learning accountability, and I had claimed my own space, both emotionally and practically. I had built a life independent of their influence, informed by the lessons of neglect, inequality, and resilience. The experience left me with a deep understanding of fairness, justice, and personal empowerment. I had endured favoritism, grown from it, and ultimately witnessed the long-delayed consequences of unchecked privilege. The story concludes not with revenge, but with growth. My parents' favoritism backfired spectacularly, revealing the fragility of entitlement and the inevitability of accountability. My brother, while struggling, learned that privilege is not a shield against reality, and I emerged stronger, wiser, and empowered with the knowledge that surviving inequality and injustice can teach lessons no favor or wealth ever could.